The rain tapped softly on the windshield, and Mark's Uber glided through the city's sleepy streets, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound. The late hour brought a thick stillness, amplified by the wet pavement reflecting the faint glow of streetlights. As he neared the next pickup, something felt off. A figure, motionless and cloaked in shadow, stood waiting at the curb. Mark hesitated but unlocked the door. The stranger climbed in, his words unsettling, his calm demeanor unnerving. The city outside faded into the night as they headed toward Oakwood, a destination that seemed to hold more than just a simple ride. The unease grew, and Mark realized he wasn't in control anymore. The rain had begun to fall as the clock ticked past midnight, its gentle patter against the windshield a soft lullaby to the quiet streets of the city. The headlights of the Uber illuminated the wet pavement as the car weaved through the sleepy roads, the faint hum of the engine filling the air. The world outside seemed to be held in a slow-motion state, where time moved sluggishly and the mundane sounds of the night were amplified by the stillness. It was during these hours, when the city was on the edge of slumber, that drivers often felt the eerie sense that something was waiting just beyond their peripheral vision. For Mark, it was just another night. He had been behind the wheel of his Uber for over 3 years, shuttling passengers from one destination to the next, hearing their stories, and offering little more than a silent presence in the background of their lives. He had long since stopped noticing the occasional odd passenger, the ones who stared too long, or the ones who mumbled strange, cryptic sentences under their breath. It was all part of the job, mundane, repetitive, and, for the most part, unremarkable. But tonight, something felt different. The air in the car was thick with an unspoken tension, the kind that crept in slowly, like the first crack of a thunderstorm on a still, humid evening. Mark tried to shake it off. It was just the lateness of the hour, he reasoned. Everyone was on edge when the world grew quiet like this. Still, his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, checking the reflection of the empty road behind him, half expecting something to appear there in the darkness. There was no reason for it, but a small part of his mind couldn't stop wondering. He glanced at the app. The next pickup was only a few blocks away, just down a dimly lit street that Mark knew all too well. The area was quiet, residential, mostly families or people coming home from work late. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, a gnawing feeling tugged at him, something he couldn't quite identify but couldn't ignore either. He clicked his turn signal and slowed as he approached the intersection, eyes scanning the empty street for any sign of movement. Then, as if summoned by the tension in the air, a figure emerged from the shadows at the curb. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The figure stood there, still and unmoving, just a silhouette against the dull glow of the streetlights. It was a man, tall and thin, with broad shoulders that seemed to stretch the fabric of his jacket. He was wearing a hood, the kind that seemed to swallow his face in darkness, but there was something about his stance that made the hairs on the back of Mark's neck stand up. The way he just waited. Mark's hand hovered over the door handle. For a brief moment, he considered driving on, maybe canceling the ride, but then the screen on his phone buzzed. The app flashed an alert, passenger waiting. That was all. No photo, no description, just the usual message that reminded him of the fact that this was just another ride. Another faceless person. Still, Mark's gut twisted. He couldn't explain why, but he had an overwhelming sense that something was wrong. He clicked the lock button, and the door to the Uber unlocked with a soft click. Mark quickly checked the rearview mirror again, trying to gather his bearings, but when he looked back up, the figure had moved closer. He was now standing directly by the door, his eyes visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. He forced a smile, trying to shake off the creeping unease that was starting to take over. "Hey, you need a ride?" he asked, his voice sounding almost too loud in the otherwise silent car. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply stared, his eyes piercing through the dimness. Mark could see the faintest glimmer of something behind them, something intense, calculating. It unnerved him. "Yeah," the man finally said, his voice deep, but devoid of any emotion. "I'm going to Oakwood." Mark nodded, his fingers tightening slightly around the steering wheel. Oakwood was on the outskirts of the city, a small, quiet area known for its secluded homes and low crime rate. But tonight, it felt like an isolated, desolate place. A place where anything could happen. And for some reason, it didn't sit right with Mark that this man wanted to go there at this hour. "All right, oh quit it is," Mark replied, forcing the words out as he shifted the car into drive. He glanced at the man again through the rearview mirror as the car pulled away from the curb, but the passenger was still staring ahead, his face hidden in shadow. For a moment, there was only the sound of the tires on the wet pavement and the occasional drip of rain tapping against the car. The silence between them was thick, so thick it almost felt suffocating. Mark tried to fill the emptiness with small talk, anything to break the tension. "You out for a late night?" he asked, his voice sounding more forced now. The man didn't respond immediately, and Mark almost felt relieved, thinking he would just ignore the question. But then, just as the car turned onto a darker, less populated street, the man spoke again. "Do you believe in the things people say about Uber drivers?" His voice was low and almost whispering, as if the question itself were dangerous. Mark caught his own breath, the question hitting him in the chest harder than he had anticipated. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though it shook just a little. The passenger's eyes remained locked on the rearview mirror, his gaze unsettling in its stillness. "The rumors. The things people say about drivers. About what happens to them when the ride is over." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them before adding, "Do you ever wonder if it's true?" Mark felt his pulse quicken, and the hairs on his neck stood up once more. He glanced over at the man again, but there was no answer in his expression, no hint of a smile, no emotion at all. Just that piercing stare. "Rumors, huh?" Mark muttered, more to himself than to the man. He laughed awkwardly, trying to brush off the words. "People say a lot of things. I don't really buy into any of that." The passenger didn't seem satisfied with that answer. He leaned forward, his breath faintly fogging the rearview mirror. "You should. You might want to. Be careful." Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. A sense of foreboding washed over him, but he tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. The streets were quiet, desolate, and the headlights of the cars sliced through the dark, casting long shadows across the empty roads. But then, just as he was about to speak again, the passenger spoke once more. "They're coming for you." The words hit Mark like a cold wave. A chill spread down his spine, and his foot slipped off the gas for a moment. The car slowed just slightly before he caught himself and pressed the accelerator again. He glanced up at the road, an empty stretch, no sign of another car, no sign of anyone else. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. Yet, the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. That gnawing sense of unease had returned, stronger than before, and it was impossible to ignore. Mark forced himself to glance over at the passenger again, but this time, the man wasn't staring straight ahead. His face was now visible, the shadows of the car's interior carving sharp angles on his features. His lips were curled into the faintest of smiles, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. No, this smile sent a rush of ice through Mark's veins. "Relax," the man said, his voice almost a whisper. "They only come when you don't expect it." And that's when Mark saw it, something he hadn't noticed before. The reflection of headlights in the rearview mirror, rapidly closing in on them. A car. The night had just taken a turn for the worse. And it was too late to turn back now. The sound of the approaching car grew louder, its headlights now a blinding presence in the rearview mirror. Mark's heart skipped a beat, his breath quickening. He glanced up at the passenger, but the man remained still, his gaze unwavering, as if the oncoming vehicle didn't concern him at all. There was something deeply unsettling about the passenger's calmness. Mark's palms began to sweat, the grip on the steering wheel tightening with every passing second. As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, Mark fought to keep his composure. He knew better than to panic, but the fear gnawing at him was undeniable. Every time he checked the rearview mirror, the headlights were closer, the shadow of the car looming larger. The pursuit was relentless, the sound of tires on wet pavement growing closer, until it was nearly deafening. Mark's mind raced, his thoughts fragmented, as he tried to calculate his next move. He could feel the sweat trickling down the back of his neck, his heart hammering in his chest. He pressed the gas pedal harder, urging the car to go faster, but the car behind them kept closing in. The road stretched ahead, empty and desolate, yet it felt like the walls were closing in. Mark's breath came in shallow bursts as he took another quick glance at the rearview mirror. The headlights were now so close that he could see the shape of the car itself, a dark silhouette with no distinguishing features. It was almost as if the car had no identity, just a looming presence that followed him. Mark's eyes flicked nervously to the passenger once more. The man had not budged. He didn't seem concerned by the pursuit, not in the slightest. Instead, he remained seated, his eyes focused on the dark road ahead, a faint smirk playing at the edges of his lips. Mark's stomach churned. The contrast between the man's calmness and the mounting danger outside was unnerving. "Who are they?" Mark's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, as he glanced at the passenger, searching for any hint of reassurance. The man's eyes shifted slightly, but the smirk never left his face. "They're not going to stop," he said, his voice so low it almost blended into the hum of the engine. "They never do." Mark's heart raced. He didn't know what the man meant, but he could feel the truth of it in his bones. The car behind him wasn't just tailing him, it was hunting him. And worse, it seemed as if the pursuit was inevitable. He was trapped in a game where there was no escape. The headlights behind him grew even more intense, a sickening brightness that seemed to stretch out like an unholy shadow. Mark's hands were shaking now, his vision narrowing as panic surged through him. He glanced at the road ahead. There was nothing, just the long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the night. No turns, no exits, nothing to break the monotony of the road. Then, the passenger spoke again, his voice calm, as if he were speaking about something trivial. "You should speed up," he suggested. "They like it when you run." Mark didn't respond, his mind struggling to keep up with the madness unfolding before him. The car behind them had closed the distance to a mere few feet. Mark could feel the presence of the other vehicle like a suffocating weight pressing against him, and every fiber of his being screamed to do something, anything, to break free from this terrifying chase. But there was nowhere to go. No place to hide. He glanced again at the man in the back seat, his unease growing with each passing second. The man wasn't just calm now, he was almost detached, as if the entire situation was unfolding like some macabre performance that he was merely watching from the sidelines. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never encountered someone so entirely unshaken by fear. It was like the passenger knew something that Mark didn't, or perhaps something that Mark didn't want to know. The pursuit behind them had reached a fever pitch. Mark's breath quickened, the panic rising within him like an uncontrollable wave. His hands were slick with sweat, and his vision blurred as the world around him seemed to tilt. The headlights were so close now, he could almost feel the heat from the other car. He could hear the engine growling behind him, the tires screeching as it closed in, gaining on them with terrifying precision. Mark's foot slammed harder on the accelerator, pushing the car to its limits, but it didn't seem to matter. The pursuing car was an unrelenting force, one that seemed to exist solely to consume him. The passenger finally broke the silence again, his voice smooth and eerie, almost as if he were speaking in a trance. "You can't outrun them, you know." Mark's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling as he glanced at the passenger, his throat tight with fear. The question hung in the air like a curse, echoing in the car's confined space. "They never stop chasing," the passenger replied, his words deliberate, measured. "They'll follow you wherever you go. Until you give them what they want." Mark's mind raced, trying to process the implications of the man's words. Who were they? What did they want? His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat louder than the last. His breath felt shallow, as though there wasn't enough air in the car to fill his lungs. He glanced at the headlights in the rearview mirror again. Closer now, impossibly close, like a predator closing in on its prey. His eyes flicked to the passenger once more. The man's gaze was fixed forward, his expression unchanged, as if the entire situation were nothing more than a casual observation. It was as if Mark's fear didn't exist for him. The man's unshakable calmness only heightened Mark's anxiety. Was the passenger in on whatever was happening? Did he know more than he was letting on? Mark's foot slammed on the gas again, the engine roaring in response. The tires screeched as the car surged forward, the headlights of the pursuing vehicle now so close that they bathed the interior of the car in an eerie, ghostly light. Mark's vision narrowed, his focus entirely consumed by the blinding light and the relentless sound of the pursuing car. His thoughts were a blur of panic and confusion, and for the briefest of moments, he wondered if he could outrun it, if there was any hope at all. But the passenger's words echoed in his mind, "You can't outrun them." The headlights from behind them suddenly flashed bright, blindingly bright, like an explosion of light. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. His foot slammed on the brake without thinking, but it wasn't enough. His mind screamed at him to move, to escape, to do anything. But as the headlights grew even brighter, he realized with a cold certainty that he had nowhere to go. The road stretched endlessly before him, a never-ending tunnel of darkness. And behind him, the relentless car, its headlights now blinding, the sound of its engine deafening, closed in. The fear that had been gnawing at him all along suddenly reached its peak, consuming every last shred of his control. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears, could taste the metal tang of terror on his tongue. His thoughts were scattered, his mind trapped in a whirlwind of dread. And then, just as the headlights seemed to consume the entire world around him, the passenger spoke again, his voice breaking through Mark's panic. "They've caught up." Mark turned to the passenger, but the man was already looking out the window, his face expressionless as the world outside seemed to slow down. Mark didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to survive. All he knew was that the car was coming closer, and there was nothing left to stop it. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears as the pursuing vehicle loomed even closer, its headlights now so bright that the world outside had become a blur of ghostly white light. He could no longer see the road ahead of him. The headlights were too blinding, too overwhelming. His vision narrowed, and for a moment he felt as though he were drowning in the glow. The sound of the car behind them, a low, menacing growl of its engine, reverberated through his chest like the growl of a beast hunting its prey. He could feel the cold sweat running down his back, his breath shallow, each inhale coming in jagged bursts. His mind raced, trying to grasp some semblance of control, but it was as though the car itself had taken on a life of its own. It was like a nightmare unfolding, one he couldn't wake up from. The headlights behind him reflected off the rearview mirror, blinding him further, forcing him to squint against the intensity of the light. He slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the car to its limits, but the pursuing vehicle didn't back off. It stayed right behind him, its presence growing stronger, more menacing with each passing second. In a panic, Mark swerved, turning the wheel sharply to the right. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as the car veered toward the shoulder of the road. For a brief moment, Mark thought he had lost the car behind him, but when he glanced back, the headlights were still there, unwavering, as though they were glued to him. The same dark silhouette followed him with relentless precision, its speed matching his own. The passenger hadn't said a word since the last cryptic comment, but now Mark couldn't help himself. "Who are they? What do they want from me?" His voice was raw, a mix of desperation and fear. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, and his heart pounded in his chest like a drum, the sound deafening. He could feel the weight of the silence in the car pressing down on him, suffocating him. Every second felt like an eternity. The man in the back seat shifted slightly, his eyes never leaving the road. There was no urgency in his movements, no panic, no fear. He was as still as a statue, as calm as ever. Mark's desperation began to gnaw at him. "You're not even scared, are you?" Mark spat, his voice shaking. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was something in his expression, something almost predatory. "Fear won't save you now," he said softly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the tension in the car like a knife. The words were as chilling as the cold wind that whipped through the open window, the smell of rain and wet asphalt filling the air. Mark's stomach twisted with anxiety, and his grip on the wheel tightened even more. The road was still empty, no sign of any other cars, no exits or intersections. The car ahead had pulled back just slightly, only to surge forward again with terrifying speed, like a predator closing in on its prey. It was impossible to shake the feeling that there was something more to this than just a random chase. The passenger continued to speak, his voice oddly calm as he watched Mark's frantic movements. "They'll follow you no matter where you go. No matter what you do," he said, each word falling from his lips like a death sentence. Mark could feel the blood drain from his face, a chill spreading through his body. "It's already too late." "Too late?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He barely recognized it. "What do you mean it's too late?" The passenger's gaze was unflinching. "Once you've been marked, there's no escaping. The moment you picked me up, you were marked." Mark's heart sank. He could feel the color draining from his face. His head spun, and a wave of nausea rolled over him. He didn't understand. What was this man talking about? What did he mean by marked? Mark's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles aching from the force. The headlights of the car behind them grew even brighter, now practically blinding Mark. The car itself felt as though it were closing in around him, suffocating him in the relentless pursuit. The engine of the pursuing vehicle roared in the distance, as though it had come alive, an insatiable machine bent on devouring him. Mark glanced up again, his mind racing, searching for some way to escape, but there was nothing. No roadblocks, no exits, just an endless stretch of pavement that seemed to wind on forever. The headlights of the pursuing car glinted off the wet surface of the road, casting sharp, jagged reflections that seemed to distort the world around him. Every time Mark glanced at the rearview mirror, the car behind him was closer. Every time he looked ahead, the road seemed to stretch on without end. "Why are you doing this to me?" Mark's voice cracked as he spoke, the words almost falling out of his mouth in desperation. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, and his chest tightened with panic. The passenger turned his head slightly, his expression still impassive, as though Mark's words were insignificant. "I'm not doing anything," he said simply. "This has nothing to do with me." Mark shot a glance at the man in the rearview mirror. "Then what the hell is going on? Why are they following me? What do they want?" The passenger sighed, as if he were bored with Mark's questions. "They want you to understand," he replied softly. "They want you to understand that there are things beyond what you can control. Things that exist in the shadows, waiting for you to notice them." The words hit Mark like a cold slap. He felt a chill seep into his bones, an oppressive weight settling over him. "I don't understand. I don't know what's happening. Poor they." His voice was barely audible, as though speaking any louder might make it all more real. The man in the back seat finally turned to face Mark fully, his eyes gleaming in the dim light of the car. "You will," he said cryptically. "Soon enough, you'll understand everything. But by then it might be too late." Mark's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. It just couldn't. This felt like something straight out of a nightmare, something he couldn't wake up from. He was stuck in this never-ending chase, this cycle of fear and confusion, and the man in the back seat seemed to know everything. It was as if he were a part of it, part of the strange nightmare that was unfolding. The headlights from the pursuing car were now practically on top of them, so close that Mark could almost hear the roar of its engine in his ears. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, only this time, it wasn't just the headlights that filled the space. There was something else, a shadow, a figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking the way. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he slammed on the brakes. The car skidded slightly on the wet road, the tires squealing in protest as the figure loomed closer. The passenger didn't flinch. "Keep going," he said calmly, as if the figure were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't stop now. Not with that figure standing ahead. But he couldn't keep going either. He was caught between a choice that seemed impossible. The headlights from the pursuing car seemed to close in on him like a pair of burning eyes. It was impossible to escape. The walls were closing in on him, and the shadow in the road was only the beginning. He gripped the wheel harder, the metal almost biting into his hands, and slammed his foot on the gas again. The car lurched forward, the sound of tires screeching in his ears, the figure in the road growing larger. Every second felt like a countdown to something terrible. Mark's chest tightened with each passing moment. He had no idea what was happening or why, but he knew one thing for sure. The terror he felt was only just beginning. The figure in the road loomed ever larger, its presence blocking the path with an unnatural stillness. Mark's eyes widened in horror as he saw the shape materialize more clearly. It was a person standing in the middle of the road, but something about them was completely wrong. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and their limbs seemed too long, stretching in ways that defied human proportions. The face was obscured by shadows, but Mark could feel the intensity of its gaze, cold, unblinking, and relentless. It didn't move, not even an inch, as the car hurtled toward it. Every part of Mark's being screamed for him to stop, to slam on the brakes and turn the wheel, but his body seemed frozen, as if it were paralyzed by the sight of this unnerving figure. The car raced forward, the screeching of the tires blending with the deafening beat of his heart. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, his foot hovering over the brake, but the car seemed to have a mind of its own. It was as if some force was propelling him forward, forcing him toward the shadowy figure in the middle of the road. He couldn't understand why he couldn't stop. The figure in the road grew closer, its form more distinct with every passing second. It was almost as if the road had become a tunnel, and the figure was the only thing at the end of it, pulling him in, swallowing him whole. Mark's vision blurred as his mind raced. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure, couldn't look away. It felt as though the world had narrowed to just that moment, that dark figure, and the car barreling toward it. The passenger in the back seat didn't move. He didn't flinch or offer any words of warning. His silence was deafening in the midst of Mark's escalating panic. The fear Mark felt grew deeper, more visceral. His breath came in shallow gasps, his pulse quickening as the distance between the car and the figure closed rapidly. The figure remained perfectly still, like a sentinel, waiting. Waiting for what? For Mark to crash into it? Or was it waiting for him to do something, anything, to break the silence? Mark's mind whirled with confusion, his thoughts scattered in a million directions. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn away, to stop, to get out of this situation, but something, some invisible force, kept him locked in place. His hands clutched the wheel tighter, the steering feeling more like a burden than a tool. The engine roared beneath him, the car's speed only amplifying the terror coursing through his veins. And then, as if the very air had thickened with the tension, a strange sensation washed over Mark. It was as if time itself had slowed, the world stretching and warping in a way he couldn't explain. His heart beat louder, each pulse vibrating through his chest, and yet the figure in the road remained as motionless as before. The headlights of the car illuminated the figure now, casting a stark, unnatural light that seemed to distort its features. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of dread that tightened around his chest, making it hard to breathe. He could no longer rationalize the situation. This wasn't just a person standing in the road. It wasn't a random obstacle or some harmless figure lost in the darkness. No, this was something else entirely. Something wrong. The figure's body began to twitch, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as though it were shaking off some kind of invisible restraint. The movement was slow, deliberate, and yet there was no sign of life in it, no sign of humanity. Mark felt his throat constrict. He wanted to scream, to break free from the paralysis that gripped him, but his voice caught in his throat, silenced by the terror that now seemed to fill the car. "Stop," Mark whispered under his breath, barely able to hear his own voice over the roaring engine. "Stop. Stop. Please, just stop." But the car didn't stop. It wouldn't. The figure was now so close that Mark could almost make out the details of its face, but it was still shrouded in shadow, a blur of darkness that made his stomach churn. Its eyes, if it had eyes, were hidden behind the darkness, but Mark could feel them, feel the weight of its gaze bearing down on him, as though it were reading every thought, every fear that raced through his mind. The fear intensified. Mark's hands grew clammy, his stomach twisting into knots. He pressed harder on the gas, hoping that if he just pushed faster, the figure would move, would disappear, but it remained rooted in place, immovable, like a nightmare come to life. The road ahead grew impossibly darker as he neared the figure, the headlights now only illuminating the creature in the middle of the road, leaving the world beyond it in a suffocating blackness. Mark could feel his breath quickening, each exhale shaky and uneven. He could hear the pounding of his heart, but it was muffled by the sound of the car's tires skidding on the slick pavement. He was seconds away from collision, and yet, there was still no sign of movement from the figure. Mark slammed his foot on the brake, but nothing happened. The car didn't slow down. The figure didn't move. The air was thick with the weight of the moment, and the world outside the car seemed to recede into nothingness. He didn't know what to do. His mind raced, the panic seeping deeper into his bones, suffocating him. His hands were sweating, the wheel slipping in his grasp. The headlights from the car behind them still flickered in the rearview mirror, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out before him, as if everything was closing in. His vision was blurring now, and all he could hear was the deafening sound of his own breathing, the only thing anchoring him to reality. The figure in the road was a wall, a barrier, something he couldn't explain. He had to get away, had to move, but the car wouldn't let him. The passenger's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "You can't outrun this," he said, his words calm, measured. The words were like a cruel reminder, a reality that Mark hadn't wanted to accept. "It's already too late." Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as the figure seemed to draw closer. It was so close now that Mark could almost feel its presence pressing against the car, suffocating him. The world outside was gone. The car had become a prison, and the figure was its warden. His heart raced as he slammed on the horn, the sound filling the small space of the car, but there was no response. The figure remained still, staring into the car with its invisible gaze, waiting. Waiting for what? Mark's thoughts fragmented, his mind on the edge of hysteria. He couldn't think clearly anymore. His body was screaming for him to do something, anything, but his hands refused to obey. The car's engine continued to growl beneath him, the tires spinning in place, but the figure didn't budge. Mark's vision swam. The headlights from the pursuing car were now completely gone, leaving him in a thick, suffocating darkness. There was only the figure and Mark and the empty road ahead. The world had narrowed to just that moment, that presence, that growing sense of doom. And then, just as Mark thought he couldn't take it any longer, the figure finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to step aside, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, the joints of its legs twisting in a grotesque fashion as it moved out of the way of the car. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the creature's face finally became visible in the headlights. But even then, it was no relief. It wasn't a face at all. It was a void, an empty space where features should have been. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. There was nothing but a deep, yawning blackness where its face should have been, as though the very concept of a face had been erased. The car swerved again, jerking Mark back into the present, but the figure had already moved out of the way. The road ahead was clear, but the terror was not over. Mark's breath was still shallow, his mind reeling, but he had no time to process it. He had to keep moving, had to get away. He pressed his foot back on the gas, but even as the car picked up speed, the figure in the road, its empty face, lingered in his mind, an indelible image that he couldn't shake. But in the back seat, the man remained eerily silent. His calm demeanor only deepened Mark's dread, the sense that whatever was happening was far from over. Whatever this was, whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning. The car sped forward, leaving the figure and its haunting, empty face behind. Mark's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he forced himself to focus on the road ahead. The headlights sliced through the thick, oppressive darkness, illuminating the narrow stretch of pavement that seemed to go on forever. The figure, though now out of sight, lingered in his mind. Its faceless gaze still burned into his thoughts, and he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that it was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of the pursuing car still trailing him. But there was nothing. The road behind him was as empty as the road in front, and for the briefest of moments, Mark allowed himself to breathe a little easier. His chest still felt tight, though, the fear not completely dissipating. He felt like he was still being watched, but he couldn't pinpoint why. The air in the car seemed heavier now, as if it had been thickened by the sheer terror of the moments that had just passed. Mark wiped his palms on his pants, trying to steady himself, but it was no use. His nerves were raw. His pulse hadn't slowed down, it had only quickened since the figure moved aside. Something didn't sit right. He should have felt relieved, but the absence of the pursuing car didn't fill him with any sense of safety. Instead, it amplified the silence in the car, the void of sound that seemed to stretch on forever. Mark risked another glance at the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection of the empty road mocked him, its vast, uninterrupted expanse reminding him of the isolation that now surrounded him. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly alone. There were no other cars, no sign of life anywhere. It was as if he had crossed some invisible threshold, stepping into a world where the rules no longer applied, where time had slowed down, and nothing was as it seemed. He forced his eyes back to the road, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that had settled over him. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers ached, but he couldn't bring himself to relax. There was a growing sense of wrongness in everything, an undercurrent of something unnameable that ran deeper than his conscious fear. The longer he drove, the more he felt as though the road itself was shifting beneath him, warping with every mile. The passenger hadn't spoken since the figure moved from the road. He sat in the back seat, perfectly still, as though he were waiting for something, or perhaps for Mark to reach some inevitable conclusion. His eyes were locked onto the road ahead, but there was no emotion in his gaze, no concern, no compassion. Just that unsettling calmness, like a predator watching its prey without any rush, knowing that the chase would eventually end in its favor. Mark couldn't take it anymore. The silence, the tension, the uncertainty, it was all too much. "What is this? What's happening?" he asked, his voice tight with desperation. The words came out in a broken rush, as though he had been holding them in for far too long. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror once again, half expecting something to be there, something he had missed. The man in the back seat finally spoke, his voice low and almost soothing, though the calmness only heightened Mark's unease. "You're not really in control of this anymore," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing heavily in the air. "The moment you let them chase you, you gave up your control." Mark's mind reeled at the statement. "What do you mean? What do you mean, gave up control?" His voice wavered between anger and panic. He couldn't understand what was happening, why he was being dragged into this nightmare, or why the man in the back seat seemed to know so much more than he was willing to share. The passenger turned his head slightly, just enough so that Mark could see his profile in the dim light. His face was expressionless, but there was something about the way he held himself, something predatory in his stillness. "The moment you picked me up," the man continued, "you sealed your fate. You brought something into your life that you couldn't escape." Mark's mind struggled to process the words, but a part of him already knew what the man was implying. The tension that had gripped him earlier began to tighten again, like a vice around his chest. He glanced at the road ahead, but it felt as though the world was slipping out of focus. "No, that can't be true. It's just some random chase. It doesn't make any sense." The man didn't respond immediately, but Mark could feel his presence shift in the back seat. The air in the car had grown even thicker, almost suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was being manipulated by forces beyond his understanding. The road ahead, once a simple path through the dark, now seemed to stretch into an uncharted expanse, an endless void that beckoned him further into the unknown. Suddenly, Mark noticed something in the distance. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, a distant, hazy light that looked like a street lamp but was too far off to make out clearly. The further he drove, the closer it seemed to get, but it didn't look like the familiar glow of city lights. It was cold, faint, almost otherworldly in its hue. Mark felt his heart rate quicken again, the sense of dread swelling within him. "What is that?" he asked, almost to himself, but the question escaped his lips before he could stop it. The passenger's eyes flicked briefly to the light, but his expression remained unchanged. "It's the point of no return," he said quietly. "Once you reach that light, you won't be able to go back. You'll have crossed over." Mark's stomach lurched. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to accept what the man was saying. Everything about this felt wrong, too surreal, too far out of reach of reason and logic. But deep down, a part of him understood that he wasn't being told a story. He was being warned. The light ahead grew brighter as they neared it, its unnatural glow casting long, twisted shadows on the road. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end as he realized that no matter how fast he drove, the light seemed to follow him, its pull inexorable. He slammed his foot down on the gas, hoping against hope that he could outrun whatever it was. The engine roared in protest, the tires screeching against the wet road, but the light didn't fade. It stayed fixed in his view, growing larger, brighter, as though it was waiting for him to reach it. Mark's breath came faster now, his eyes darting back and forth between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the pursuing car once more. But it was still gone. The headlights were no longer there. The silence in the car became deafening, the only sound the rapid thumping of Mark's heart. The man in the back seat hadn't moved, but Mark felt the weight of his gaze, even without looking directly at him. The air felt charged, like the stillness before a storm. Mark's fingers tightened on the wheel, his grip so strong that his joints ached. He glanced at the light again, and something inside him shifted, something cold, something deep and primal. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't escape it. As the car hurtled toward the light, Mark's mind screamed for him to stop, to turn around, but his body refused to obey. The road was narrowing, twisting into a single path, the light now consuming his entire field of vision. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the man spoke again. "They've caught up with you." Mark turned to look at him, his face pale, his mouth dry. Who's caught up with me?" The passenger's gaze was steady, unwavering. "The ones who chase you. They're always with you. They're never far behind." Mark's heart stopped. The light in front of him was blinding now, and he had no choice but to continue toward it. But as he drove on, it became clear that whatever was happening, whatever force was at work, had already won. He was trapped. The car, the figure in the road, the passenger, everything was part of the same twisted game, and Mark was nothing more than a pawn. As the light engulfed him, all hope of escaping dissolved into the darkness, and Mark finally understood. He wasn't driving away from anything. He was driving toward something that had been waiting for him all along. The car entered the light, the world around Mark dissolving into a sea of blinding white. It was as if the very air had turned into liquid, thick and suffocating, yet weightless. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the light engulfed the entire car, an overwhelming presence that filled every corner, every inch of the space around him. He couldn't see the road anymore, couldn't see the night, couldn't see anything beyond the overwhelming glow. The world outside the car ceased to exist. There was nothing but this relentless, unnerving radiance. For a moment, Mark felt suspended, as though time itself had stopped. His heart, which had been pounding in his chest like a drum, now seemed to slow, each beat heavy and deliberate. His hands still gripped the wheel, but it felt like they were no longer his own, as though his body was no longer responding to him. His eyes, wide with fear, darted from side to side, desperately searching for anything familiar, any sign of the world he knew. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of white light, stretching out before him like the mouth of some great, insatiable beast. And yet, there was no sound. No hum of the engine, no rush of the wind, no screech of the tires on the wet road. Only silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Mark's breath felt shallow, as though the air itself was too thick to breathe. His mind raced, each thought a blur of confusion and dread. What was happening? Where was he? What had he driven into? His fingers trembled on the steering wheel, and for a moment, it felt like the car itself was no longer moving. The stillness was unnerving, as though he were stuck in some kind of suspended animation. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed. Seconds? Minutes? It didn't matter. Time had lost its meaning here, in this strange, unnatural space. Mark turned his head to look at the passenger, hoping for some kind of answer, some kind of reassurance. But the man remained as he had been the entire time, calm, composed, almost serene. His face was still hidden in the shadow, his eyes focused on nothing, yet there was a certain emptiness to his gaze, as though he were already somewhere else. The contrast between the stillness of the passenger and the chaos raging inside Mark was maddening. "Where are we?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper, a tremor of fear threading through his words. It felt ridiculous to even ask, considering that he knew there was no logical answer, but the question spilled from his lips before he could stop it. His pulse thrummed in his ears as the silence stretched on, the thick, oppressive air pressing against his chest. The man didn't answer immediately. The pause that followed felt like an eternity, each second dragging on, stretching the fear that clung to Mark like a second skin. Then, finally, the man spoke, his voice low and dispassionate, like he were discussing something trivial. "We're not going anywhere. We've already arrived." Mark's mind reeled at the words. "Arrived?" he repeated, as though saying it out loud might help him understand the meaning behind them. But he already knew. Deep down, he knew exactly what the man was implying. The car had entered a place beyond time and space, a place that Mark could never hope to escape from. This wasn't just a road. This wasn't just a chase. This was something far worse, something that had been waiting for him, and now he had crossed into it. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing over him, drowning him in the enormity of it. There was no going back. Whatever this was, whatever force had drawn him here, it was beyond his control. His hands clenched tighter around the wheel, the leather smooth beneath his fingertips, but it was no comfort. In fact, it only heightened the sense of helplessness he felt, as though he were tied to the car, tied to this nightmare, with no way to break free. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the air seemed to press in on him from all sides. It was as if the car had become a coffin, the light surrounding it a tomb, and Mark was trapped inside, with no way out. His throat tightened, and the words came out in a ragged gasp. "What do you want from me?" The passenger's expression didn't change. He remained as calm as ever, as though he were unaffected by the chaos that churned inside Mark. "Nothing," he said simply, his voice carrying a strange, unsettling calmness. "I want nothing from you. But they do." Mark's eyes widened. "Who?" The question spilled from his lips without thought, his voice trembling with a desperation he couldn't hide. He didn't want to know the answer, but he had to ask. He had to understand what was happening to him. The man turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Mark's for the first time. There was something in his eyes, something that Mark couldn't quite place, something dark and knowing. "They're always there, waiting," he said, his voice soft, but with an edge of something far darker beneath it. "They've been following you for a long time. Watching, waiting for you to make a choice. And now that you've made it, there's no going back." Mark's breath hitched in his throat. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the unbearable silence. The idea of being watched, of being hunted, took on an entirely new meaning. It wasn't just the car behind him anymore. It wasn't just the figure in the road. It was something much more insidious, something that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for this moment to come. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but the more he tried to understand, the more elusive it all became. It was as if he had stepped into a world that had no rules, no logic, no reason. The road had twisted into something unrecognizable, and Mark could feel himself being pulled further into it, further into whatever nightmare this was. The walls of the car felt like they were closing in, the light around him intensifying until it was almost unbearable. "Why me?" Mark whispered, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Why did this happen to me?" The passenger's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You were always meant to be here," he said, his voice smooth, almost comforting. "You were always going to end up in this place at this moment. It was only a matter of time." The words settled over Mark like a cold, wet blanket, suffocating him. The light around him grew brighter, the pressure in the car increasing, until it felt like the very air was being sucked out of the space. Mark's chest tightened, and his breathing became more labored. He was drowning in this light, drowning in the heavy silence that seemed to suffocate him. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to escape, to run, to break free from this trap, but it was too late. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't go anywhere. The road had ended, and he had crossed over into a place where there was no turning back. The car suddenly jerked, as though something had pulled it forward, and Mark's grip on the wheel tightened instinctively. The air grew colder, and the light began to flicker, its intensity wavering for a split second before it surged forward once more. The sensation was jarring, like being plunged into an icy cold pool, and for a moment, Mark felt like he might drown. But just as quickly, the light stabilized again, blinding, overwhelming, and unyielding. Mark couldn't see anything now, couldn't tell where the road ended or where it began. The world outside was gone, swallowed by the light. All he could hear was the faint hum of the engine beneath him, the soft sound of his own breathing, and the crushing silence that filled the car. There was no escape from this place, no way to outrun whatever had been chasing him. He had crossed the threshold, and now there was no going back. As the light consumed everything around him, Mark understood. The chase wasn't over. It had only just begun. The car moved on, but it felt like it had stopped. Time itself seemed suspended in this bizarre realm of light, a world that was no longer bound by the rules Mark had known. The sensation of movement was there, yet he couldn't grasp it. There was no sense of progress, no sense of distance. It felt like he was floating, drifting through a void, weightless and powerless. The road had vanished, and there was no longer any indication of where he was going, or even if he was going anywhere at all. The only thing he could feel was the relentless hum of the engine beneath him, the only thing he could hear was the soft rhythm of his breathing, the subtle shift of his body in the seat. The air had grown colder, thicker, and every exhale felt like it was swallowed by the oppressive weight of the light around him. His chest tightened as the temperature seemed to plummet, and a strange, unfamiliar sensation crept through his veins, a feeling that he couldn't quite name, but that made him shiver nonetheless. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white, but there was no real force behind it anymore. His hands moved mechanically, as if his body had become a stranger to him, operating on autopilot. He had no choice but to keep moving, to keep driving. His eyes, though, never strayed far from the rearview mirror, even though he knew that the car behind him, the one that had been following him for so long, was no longer there. The rearview mirror was just as empty as the road behind him. And yet, Mark could still feel it, the presence, the gaze of something watching, waiting. His pulse quickened, his heart thumping in his chest, but it wasn't the fear of being chased anymore. It was something deeper, something far more sinister. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The passenger in the back seat hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. His stillness had become a constant source of unease, a reminder that Mark was not alone in this strange, distorted place. The silence between them had grown heavy, unbearable. Mark's mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could help him understand what was happening, but the answers kept slipping away, like smoke through his fingers. What was this place? What were these forces at work? Why was he here? The passenger shifted slightly in the back seat, breaking the silence, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't spoken a word in what felt like hours, and now, the stillness was being shattered again. The man's voice, when it came, was soft, almost soothing, but Mark couldn't help the shiver that ran down his spine. "You're looking for answers," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. "But there are no answers here, not for you." Mark's throat constricted at the words. He had no idea what to say, what to think. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, though he knew there was nothing there. Nothing except the vast emptiness, the haunting silence that stretched endlessly behind him. He turned his gaze back to the road ahead, but there was no road. There was nothing to guide him, nothing to keep him tethered to reality. Only the light, bright, overwhelming, and all-consuming. "What do you mean?" Mark finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, but the silence that followed felt suffocating, like the weight of the universe was pressing down on him. He knew that he shouldn't have asked, that the answer would only add to the growing sense of dread, but he couldn't help himself. The need to understand, to find meaning in all of this, was too great. The passenger didn't respond immediately. His silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Mark's eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, but there was nothing but the bright, blinding light and the endless stretch of time that had no beginning and no end. It was as if he were suspended in a void, an endless loop with no escape. His thoughts were spiraling, his mind struggling to grasp at something solid, something real. But the more he tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped away. Then, finally, the man spoke, his voice calm, almost detached. "This place," he said, "is where lost things go. Things that can't be found. Things that don't belong anywhere else. This is where the ones who are marked are brought." Mark's blood ran cold at the words, his mind reeling. "Marked? What do you mean marked?" His voice cracked with fear, but the words spilled out anyway. He felt as though his body were no longer his own, as though his movements were being controlled by some outside force. The fear was consuming him, but he couldn't stop himself from asking the question. What does that even mean? The passenger's eyes flicked to him for a brief moment, but there was no emotion in his gaze. "You've already crossed over, Mark," he said, his tone almost pitying. "There's no way back. Not now. You've been marked and now you belong to them." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He could feel his stomach lurch, the acid rising in his throat. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be real. This can't be happening. I don't believe you." But the man's words were unyielding. "You're here because you chose to be. You're here because they wanted you to be here. And now you have to face the consequences." The weight of those words crashed down on him, and Mark felt the full force of the truth settle over him like a suffocating blanket. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. What had started as a simple ride had turned into something far darker, something that had twisted beyond recognition. The fear that had been gnawing at him for so long now gave way to something far worse, a deep sense of hopelessness. He had no power here, no agency. He was a pawn in a game that he couldn't begin to understand, and now he was trapped in a world where there was no escape. The car continued its slow, relentless journey through the light, but it felt like they were getting nowhere. The sensation of movement had all but disappeared. Mark's mind whirled with questions, but no answers came. Only the oppressive weight of the silence, the strange, suffocating stillness that had settled around him like a fog. The light around him remained as blinding as ever, but it had become almost familiar, as if it were a part of him, as if it were something he had always known. He glanced once more at the passenger, but the man had fallen silent again, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. There was no emotion in his face, no sign of concern. It was as though this entire situation was nothing more than a passing moment to him. Mark's hands were shaking, his chest tight with fear, but he couldn't look away. He couldn't look away from the man in the backseat, from the words that had been spoken, from the growing realization that he was trapped in a place he could never leave. "What happens now?" Mark asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. His voice was small, fragile, barely a whisper in the heavy silence of the car. His heart was racing in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to care anymore. He had to know. The passenger's lips curved into a thin, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Now you wait," he said softly. "You wait for them to come." The words hung in the air, suffocating in their finality. Mark could feel the walls closing in on him, the light pressing down on him like a physical force. And all he could do was wait. Wait for the darkness that was already beginning to creep into the edges of his vision. Wait for the consequences of the choices he had made. Wait for them to come for him. And with each passing second, the terror grew deeper, the dread more consuming. There was no way out. There was no escape. The car seemed to glide through the light, its motion now almost imperceptible, like it was suspended between two worlds. The oppressive glow that surrounded them felt less like illumination and more like an encroaching force, wrapping around Mark, tightening with every passing second. He could feel it creeping into his bones, sinking deep into his skin, as if it were meant to suffocate him slowly, bit by bit. His thoughts, once sharp and frantic, were now dulled, as if the very light itself had drained the energy from his mind. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the car, the empty road that stretched endlessly before him, and the man in the back seat whose silence had become unbearable. Mark's pulse thudded in his ears, but the sound of his own heartbeat felt distant, far away, swallowed by the weight of the silence in the car. He had asked the man so many questions, tried to understand what was happening, but every answer he received only deepened the mystery. The man's cryptic words had created more confusion, more fear. And yet, even as the terror built inside him, a part of him knew that he couldn't escape it. There was no way out of this place, no exit, no escape route. He had been led into this world, and now he was trapped in it. And worse, the man's words about waiting echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. He didn't know who or what they were waiting for, but he could feel it in his bones that whatever it was coming. The road ahead, though it was barely visible through the blinding light, began to take on a strange, almost fluid quality. It wasn't solid anymore, not like a regular road, but more like a river of light, shifting and undulating as if it were alive. Mark's vision blurred again, his mind struggling to hold onto any shred of reality, but it slipped away, leaving only the overwhelming presence of the light, the suffocating silence, and the vague sense that he was heading toward something he couldn't avoid. His hands clenched tighter around the steering wheel, his knuckles white with the effort. The light flickered briefly, and in that fleeting moment, the air inside the car seemed to shift. The temperature dropped again, but this time, it wasn't just a chill. It was a biting cold, like the kind you feel when standing at the edge of an abyss. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end, his skin prickling as though the very air was charged with some kind of unseen energy. His breath came in shallow gasps, the cold creeping down his throat, settling in his chest like a heavy weight. The man in the back seat still hadn't moved. His face, though partially obscured by shadow, remained unreadable. There was no emotion in his eyes, nothing to indicate that he was aware of Mark's growing panic. He sat perfectly still, as if he were no longer a part of this world, or perhaps as though he had never truly been a part of it in the first place. Mark wanted to scream, wanted to ask the man more questions, but he knew it would be futile. The answers would only serve to make things worse, to draw him deeper into whatever this place was. Suddenly, the light flickered again, this time more violently. The entire car jerked, as though it had been pulled by some unseen force, and for a moment, Mark thought they were going to crash. His heart skipped a beat as his hands gripped the wheel tighter, his body tensing in anticipation of the impact that never came. Instead, the car continued to glide forward, but now it felt different, darker, heavier, as if the light itself had become a shadow, stretching longer, deeper, more oppressive. Mark's breathing quickened, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The light, which had been so blinding, was now dimming, its intensity fading slowly, like the last vestiges of a dying fire. The road ahead remained just as dark and unyielding as before, but now, there was a strange sense of depth to it, a sense that the darkness was more than just the absence of light. It felt like something was lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, something waiting, watching, with eyes that Mark couldn't see but could feel. The man in the back seat finally moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. His head tilted slightly to one side, and Mark's breath caught in his throat as the man's eyes met his for the first time. There was something unnatural in the way he looked at him, something unsettling in his gaze, as if he were studying Mark, trying to read him like an open book. The silence between them grew thicker, heavier, and Mark felt his chest tighten, his breath hitching in his throat.